Hello, everybody. Welcome back to the Everything HR podcast. I'm your host, Manuel Martinez, founder and CEO of Omni HR. Today, Dorian and I will be discussing 4 common HR mistakes and how I avoid them.
Yes, sir. Um, so my first question is, how important is it to update the employee handbook, and why?
Gotcha. So, the employee handbook, first off, is actually going to be a part of the compliance side. So, making sure that your employment compliance is really solid is extremely important. You want to update it pretty much as frequently as you change policies. I wouldn't recommend overly changing it. You want to set certain things in place so that way, all of your team members know what's going on. They know what rules to follow and things like that. So roughly every like 6 months, I would say possibly revisiting them. Uh, but other than that, really, you just kind of want to create something that people can read, understand, follow, and if there are any changes, making sure it's not just a memo, making sure that it's an actual policy change, because there is a difference. And that is one of the mistakes that a lot of HR people do kind of have. They have like 15 memos of policy changes, which aren't actually policy changes. So stuff like that is pretty important. But I would say probably every 6 months to a year, just revisit it, double check, make sure that it's up to date, and anytime you do make a change, it's very important to make sure all of your team members sign it. Uh, it's very hard when it comes to the compliance side of things, holding people accountable if they're not actually knowing kind of what the change is.
Right. Okay. Yeah. I agree. I mean, like between 6 months and a year, definitely policies should be updated because things change. Um, my next question would be, how does a company avoid mismanaging employee data, and what steps should a company take so that they can avoid those things?
All right. One of the biggest things that I see personally is going all electronic. So I was working at a company and in HR, and basically everything was just papers, and I mean archives, to the point where they were around for quite a long time.
Okay.
They did not move to an electronic system, and they just had archives of paperwork from years. Because technically, you are required. Well, this is dependent on the state, but you're required to hold documentation for a certain amount of time. Even after they leave, certain states actually still require you to hold their documentation for a few years. Um, so having everything electronic, one, saves on space, two, helps you identify and find things quicker. Because I'll tell you right now, when I had to find an employee record from someone and they've been in the company for however long, you had to go sift through all these archives and look through all this stuff, and it was a giant pain. So I
This
would say going electronic.
sounds terrible. Go out there and just try to find all that employee paperwork filed, Lord knows where. Um, so my only question is about going like digital, whatever it may be, back on the cloud or whatever you may store your employee files on. Is hacking. Like, how can you prevent like hackers from gaining access to that information, and your employees' information?
That's a really good point. A lot of human resource information systems or human resource management systems, they are responsible for their own security.
Okay.
All of them, or at least they should have security in place for that. So that would be like your two-point authentication systems, email, your password changes, things like that. But in a nutshell, it always comes down to the company itself. They're the ones responsible for it. Having good, this is kind of a military side of it, but keeping all of the personal information very secure and things like that is extremely important. And realistically, it could be something as simple as, if you leave your computer, make sure that it's off. Or if you have an office, make sure it's closed and locked. Just small things like that can help at a base level. But then, you have the more strategic level, which is
Right.
making sure those larger strategic security systems are put in place.
Right. Okay. Those are, I mean, yeah, for sure. I really like that answer there. Because I know like nowadays, you get hacked. Uh, People get hacked pretty often. Like there's always like a hack once a week or something about somebody's employee's data that's getting leaked. Um, you know, overseas or whatever it may be. Um, so I'm just curious to know like how did those companies handle it. It'd be maybe on our next segment I can come back with an answer. Do some research and see how they handle it for sure. Um, yeah.
I got you. I mean, I can say on the short term at least, most of the times what I've seen is companies will hire a third party and they'll actually have a security like entity that will do kind of the counter.
Right, inside the company, right?
Correct. Yeah.
So what I forgot what that would be called. The I don't remember. I know what you're talking about. Yeah, they have the whole IT like cybersecurity kind of deal where they're monitoring like access and like everything like that. For your company, would you think about adding that as a extra measure?
Yeah, well, we actually already have our security goes hand in hand with HR software because, as you said, it holds so much really important employee data
Hmm.
that we already have security with our current side. So we kind of built it all together.
Okay.
So the encryptions and all the back end kind of systems were all built in from the drop.
Oh
It
wow.
wasn't like an afterthought. It was from the beginning. We understand how important security is, and we were already kind of built that into the team.
Okay. Dang, yours sounds very secure and safe. All right, so moving on to my next question. What would your hiring process go like, and what would be some good interview questions as an interviewer if you were interviewing for a role at your company?
Okay, yeah, great. So from the drop, I would probably start with saying, what roles do you actually need? So there's a difference between need and want. This is kind of something I go over with like my 7-year-old daughter. Uh, but in a company, it's really just the same thing. Are you hiring a role because of a need or because you kind of think that you want this role? That's the first thing. So doing like a recruitment forecast, identifying your operations, what you're going to need in the future, the next 6 months, the next year, uh, and then from there, backfill. So okay, so in 6 months to a year, this is how we've been doing so far in our operations from the past. This is what we'll probably need from the future. That's what we're going to hire for. That's a really good tool that a lot of companies do not use. So forecasting, planning ahead, and then prepping for that instead of just filling in a role because you're in dire need of one and you need to just sit a butt in the seat within the next 6 months is a very different hiring process. So if you can plan ahead and then you can fill it in that way, you're able to take a little bit more time and make sure that you get the right person. So going a little bit more into the interview process, the questions really depend on the position itself. For example, I won't be asking an entry level HR generalist the same thing I'd be asking a chief human resource officer.
Right.
Those roles are extremely different, and then the interview should reflect on the level of the role.
Okay.
Even the amount of interviews. For example, if I'm just hiring an entry level role, I may not need 3 rounds of interviews. One may be sufficient.
Right.
But if I was hiring, a VP of HR or IT or, whatever high level role, that would probably require quite a few cycles, quite a few, conversations. You really want to make sure that you're hiring the right person for the right role.
Right.
But questions could really include anything. You have to be careful because there are certain things that you can and cannot ask. Very important.
And what are those?
Uh, so discrimination, equal opportunity, questions like those are very, you got to be very careful with those. Age, pretty much anything that you could make a decision to discriminate someone against, those are questions that are just solid no-goes. Um, Amount of children they have, if they're pregnant, like those are all kind of things that, if it could affect the hiring decision, then you can't do it.
Right.
And there's actually a technique called blind interviews and blind recruiting, which is a pretty interesting idea. Basically, if you never saw the person, if you didn't even know their name, and you just saw their resume for what it was, you had a conversation with them and you find out about their information just for what it is, that's considered kind of the blind recruiting. So nothing, no demographic information, no background will affect your decision making process in that hiring.
Okay. All right. So I'm gonna go on to the last question here. How would you build a training development plan for an HR journalist, and what do you think the best approach would be for that training development plan.
Gotcha. So understanding the role is really important first off. So for example, an HR generalist, they're more of like a jack of all trades. They're not specializing in a specific field for the most part. They're responsible for all the HR functions. So for example, instead of being just a recruiter, they could do recruiting, onboarding, training, um, employee benefits. They could be doing all the seven functions of HR as opposed to just specializing in one field. So that is very important. uh, Being a jack of all trades is great because you get to dabble in a little bit of everything, but at the same time, you're not as proficient in any one aspect. So in my situation, what I would likely do if I was hiring an HR generalist is I would see kind of what role they would need to do the most, connect them with a mentor and with specific training for what their role will actually consist of. So for example, if they were responsible for payroll, then I would make sure to put them with our current payroll team, make sure that they've follow them, understand how to do audits, and kind of go through all the tax forms and things that they would need to really understand. As opposed to if it was an HR generalist who was more on the training and development side, getting them a mentor that really understood how to speak in front of people, how to have conversations, how to explain things and break it down in a way that people can really understand it, as opposed to just, throwing out random information, hoping people pick it up.
Yeah,
So I definitely would think it would depend on the role specifically, but then make sure that this kind of comes in the forecasting. What exactly are you hiring for? And then from there, you train them on that.
gotcha. All right. Yeah. So those are all my questions that I have for you today. Did you have any questions for me or anything like that?
I mean, not right now, but yeah, I really appreciate our conversation. And yeah, so if you stuck with us this long, I do truly appreciate it. If you like the content, please rate the show. And if you're feeling a little crazy, maybe share it with someone. Have a great one.